So, I mean, if we were to look at this and we have, let's say, two sort of distinct tracks that are parallel in terms of how we've gotten to where we are today. We have, sort of on a personal level, someone may have like a certain desire for celebrity and wanting feedback that is positive, and there may be, some trauma associated. Who knows where to take them down to a certain road? I mean, I'm talking in general. I'm not even thinking about anybody in specific. But in terms of movements, we have this lack of accountability, and we have, I guess, a frustration of nothing's being happening. Maybe that's a similar thing. Let's talk about like sort of like the circumstance that's taken place really over the past 10 years, because it feels like a lot of this got accelerated after, and it's tough to disaggregate, when Sanders' campaign ended and COVID happened, because that was basically the same month, right? Like, but it does feel like there was a lot of people who thought there was a movement happening to address these things, and then in a month it's gone, and also we're in lockdown. Absolutely. And everything got jumbled then, because how do you this push to sort of like both emancipate us from COVID also involved like, you low paid workers go first, and you're sort of the chum that we're going to put out there to keep our transition, going. And things got really haywire there. And there's movements on the right that are funding this.
Well, yeah, and I think that there's if you think about something like school closures, right, and the way schools became such a battleground, masking policies, vaccination policies, and schools closing down and staying closed, in some cases for a very, very long time. The truth is, the main reason I moved back to Canada was because the schools were open in British Columbia. That's why I stayed. I moved back to be near my parents. So I thought it was temporary, but when I realized I could send my kid to an open school, I was like, I think I'm staying. Like that was a very big deal to me as a parent. I have a neuroatypical kid, and he needed to be in school. He couldn't do Zoom classes. That was not possible for him. And I think that there was when I say that we become reactive to what is going on in the mirror world, what I mean is that when an issue becomes their issue, so they're the ones talking about some of the problems with these policies, then we are just the ones just offering blanket support. Yeah, great. Close the schools. Yeah, get everybody. Yeah, you need to get vaccinated to go to work. And download the app. And it's not true that the apps could listen to our phone conversations, but it is true that when you insert technology, you allow it to mediate people's access to spaces, that is going to exclude people based on wealth. It's going to exclude people based on all kinds of things. It's not a society I particularly want to live in. But when that started to become a right-wing issue, because it's being funded and propped up by people on the right who understand this to be strategic, then we're just the obedience people. And that is a gift to them, because it means more and more people are going to look for anyone who's talking about issues that they care about, and they're going to be the only ones. There is a lot at work. And obviously a big piece of it is the attention economy. When you talk about the past 10 years or a figure like Alex Jones, there have always been conspiracy theorists, but I don't think never before have so many people been able to, earn a living based on who can make the most outrageous claim quickly, right? So it's the collision of people looking to ways to make sense of the world, more and more shocking events, and there's going to be more of them in the era of climate change, and all of these people who are just ready, and unburdened by any need to the truth, to fealty to the truth, to just make whatever is going to get the clicks. And
didn't Trump also add to this sort of like binary nature in the way we respond? I mean, because I think it's even lost in the context of like, the school shutdowns, because the unions were basically saying, the teachers union were saying like, we don't want to go in until it's safe. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that until COVID's gone. That means until we expend the money to put things like air filters in a school, or to make sure that, like, we have an ability to have some distancing when we eat, which of course we have no social structure in which to provide any of that stuff and to address any of that stuff. And so it was not a question of like, we don't want to go into school. It was like, we don't want to go into school if it's going to be a meat grinder.
Exactly. And so this is where it intersects with, 40 years of neoliberal economic policies that have defunded the schools, that have defunded healthcare. And so it isn't just sending your kid to class, it's sending your kid to a class with 35 other kids and one teacher and very little time outdoors and decrepit infrastructure and no, terrible air. So, but this points to what I mean by it's holding up a mirror to the left and why we can't just be reactive. Look, I think people should get vaccinated. I think people should have been wearing masks. And I think a lot of those schools did need to be closed where COVID was surging. Absolutely. But that's not the end of the demands. If you have a robust left, you are demanding smaller classrooms. You are demanding, creative responses, more outdoor education. You're demanding more nurses, more doctors, real investments in public health care. Talk about the Bernie campaign, that juxtaposition here. Many of us were, including me, campaigning with everything we had for a candidate whose centerpiece of his campaigns was universal public health care. Yeah. So it isn't just that, these, like Bernie's collapse coincides with lockdown. It's also the collapse of the idea of universal health care coincides with the pandemic. And a huge part of the reason why the U.S. was hit as hard as it was is because it has such a dysfunctional healthcare system.
I think a lot of the real, like the huge death count in New York in those first a month or two was a function of Medicaid hospitals, public hospitals being shut down by Andrew Cuomo in the years prior to it by 20 or 30%. And so we can track, the death rates because of the lack of those hospitals.
Well, so, I think the bottom line, just one thing I would just say, and I feel like all of my responses are coming down to the fact that we actually need a real left. And we've had a very sort of online, very sort of personal branding based left. It hasn't been a fighting left. We're starting to see some examples of a left that is back on the picket line, that is back talking about economic justice. Also, we're seeing a resurgence of an anti-war left around the huge Palestine solidarity, ceasefire protests. And, I've been part of a lot of these conversations where people are saying, yes, we are demanding a ceasefire. We're demanding that Israel abide by a ceasefire and that this not be some little temporary 4-day thing, but that this actually be the beginning of peace with justice in the region. But also a new robust anti-war movement that understands colonialism, that understands imperialism, that understands capitalism, that isn't just about this one call to stop now. I think that's the best way to confront this weird political scrambling that we've been talking about. You're not going to fight it with content moderators. You're going to fight it by giving people a real alternative of social movements with political power that stand to change things materially in many people's lives.
Well, you have a chapter on Israel and Palestine, which is quite, relevant, obviously, even though I'm sure you wrote it before. You must have written this all before October 7th, obviously. And that is that essentially Israel's politics and its far-right politics are a doppelganger of much of the nationalism that you described that Steve Bannon's kind of accolades are displaying. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the term doppelganger politics comes from a British academic named Carolyn Rooney, a scholar of Middle East studies, who describes Israel's politics as a doppelganger politics in the sense that the argument for Israel as a Jewish homeland, as a Jewish state, was the idea that the way to fight anti-Semitism was not to fight for universal values around and justice, but to have a fortress nationalist project. And it sort of accepted the premise that the reason why Jews have been targeted for millennia is because Jews don't have a state of their own. And so that's what Zionism offered. And it wasn't, not all forms of Zionism were as invested in this idea of a fortress state. That was always a more right-wing version of Zionism. There were always figures like Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, who wanted a Jewish homeland to be part of an Arab federation. But that is not the Zionism that won. And the Zionism that won was this idea that, we Jews will have a fortress state of our own, and kind of put a gun to the head of anti-Semites and be safe that way. And I think the extreme vengeance-fueled response to October 7th is a response to the fact that October the 7th showed that was not possible. It pierced the bubble of security without justice in Israel, which is what has been, since the Oslo process collapsed. You've had successive Israeli governments who have claimed that it would be possible to have a normal, secure life in Israel without any peace process whatsoever. And there would just be this ongoing grind and more fortressing, right? Like the wall is a relatively new development, post 9/11. And when that was breached on such a huge and horrific scale on October 7th, it wasn't, the whole project came into crisis. And this extreme response, which is like, it is, in my view, it is not about eradicating Hamas. It is about reestablishing this claim that it is possible to have this bubble of security without justice, without any kind of response to Palestinian rights. And it's not going to work. It's going to breed more violence. And that's why there's been, I think, such strong Jewish leadership in response, and saying, this is madness.
It's like a white knuckled attempt to mow the lawn again, as it were, and it's just not. I don't, in the words of famed word, I think it was an Israeli general who said that was basically the way that they had decided to deal with Palestinians.